Hi, I'm Dan Costa, editor-in-chief of PCMag.com, and welcome to Fast Forward, where we have ongoing conversations about living in the future. My guest today is George Conard. George leads Project Shield, Google's denial of service mitigation service. It's part of Jigsaw. They do some fascinating work. It's very important work. We're going to talk about how to protect free speech on the internet, how to protect journalists, how to protect dissidents, and who exactly are committing all of these denial of service attacks. George, thanks so much for joining me.
Hey, thanks. It's great to be here.
So let's start, before we get into the technical details of denial of service attacks, network infrastructure, how did you get to this place in New York City at Google's headquarters? We're actually streaming this live from North Korea, ironically enough. How did we get here?
We can talk about the room in a minute. I started my career ages and ages ago in the tech industry at Microsoft. So I spent about 7 years there working in the education space, international marketing, building developer tools for kids coming up through computer science programs. But then in between Microsoft and when I landed at Google, which was about 6 years ago, I had the opportunity to work in the international development space, specifically in microfinance, and was able to spend a year living in Rwanda, working on how to use mobile phones and technology like that, along with microfinance, to try to help improve people's lives.
It was like the dawn of the M-Pesa area.
It was around the time that M-Pesa, one country over in Kenya, was starting to come up, and spent a bunch of time there at Grameen Foundation, and then as I joined Google, spent a bunch of time in different parts of Google, including working on internet access in emerging markets. But then this opportunity to come and join the Jigsaw team came up, and it gave me this kind of amazing, new chance to bring both of those pieces together, to use the resources of a company like Google and the engineering talent that we have here at Jigsaw, but to work on things that really, help make a difference in people's lives.
So let's talk a little bit about, everybody knows Google. What Jigsaw fits into Google how? What's its purpose?
So Jigsaw is actually an alphabet company. We started as something called Google Ideas about 6 years ago, when Google was just Google, and started off as a think tank trying to think about how can we use technology to think about some of the hard geopolitical problems that are out there. It was something that Eric Schmidt at the time, who was the CEO, really wanted Google to be thinking about more. And so Google Ideas was founded by Jared Cohen, who's now our CEO. And over the years evolved from just being a think tank and kind of doing research to still doing those things, but also bringing engineers on and starting to build products. And so when Alphabet was formed, Jigsaw was created as an entity under Alphabet to look at how can we do this kind of research, but also how can we build products to help make people safer using technology.
It almost seems like Jigsaw was formed, too, when the company got big enough, had global reach, global scale, global implications, and you wanted to have technological solutions to some of the problems you were seeing in the world.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And our focus for Jigsaw is really on thinking about the most vulnerable users in the world. So whether that is someone who is living in a country with very repressive laws, very repressive restrictions on information, or is an activist someplace trying to promote human rights, or is an independent journalist in a country where maybe independent journalists aren't, taken with great favor, how can we use technology to try to help keep them safe and help keep the information that they're producing, whether it's journalists or human rights organizations, accessible to the people who need it. And that, I think, fits in very well with Google's overall mission, right, of how do you make information universally accessible and useful to people, but in this very, very specific context where you have really vulnerable users who might be under attack of some sort. So
let's talk about Project Shield, where you have a very specific enemy that you're trying to defeat and a very specific solution. What does Project Shield do?
So Project Shield is a free service for news publishers and journalists, human rights organizations, as well as elections monitoring and information sites. And we are using defenses that we've built, as well as Google's infrastructure, to protect these kind of sites from DDoS, distributed denial of service attacks. And Shield, the history of Shield is kind of interesting, and it fits into what we were just talking about. Several years ago, through work that we did going out and getting out into the world and talking to people who are under attack like this, started seeing news publishers, whether it's in the Ukraine or in the US in some cases, or elections boards in different parts of the world, that during an election were being DDoSed in an attempt to try to prevent election results, for example, from getting out, or to prevent the different sides of the story in the Ukraine during that crisis from being told. And thought, this is important information to get out. And Google's had a lot of experience with DDoS attacks. So I thought, is there something that we can do to bring these things together? Started experimenting with how we could use our technology to protect these sites. Found that yes, we could do it. Yes, it was delivering some really good value to them. And then built and launched Project Shield about 1.5 years ago and opened it up to all the world's news and human rights organizations.
So I've been covering DDoS attacks for 20 years, it seems like.
Yeah.
They've evolved a lot since then, but for people that don't understand how they work, what does it take to launch one of these DDoS attacks?
Well, I think let's start with what a DDoS attack actually is, because I think it's interesting, and you're right. Not everybody kind of gets what it is, and you don't have to go into the super technical details to do that. And one of the ways that I like to talk about it is, imagine that if you have kids, imagine your daughter is turning 10, and you're going to have a birthday party for her, and you're going to have cake at the birthday party, and you invite 10 or 15 of her friends. But somebody who doesn't, let's say they don't like you, not that they don't like your daughter, doesn't like you and wants to interfere with this in some way. So they get an invitation printed up, and they post 5,000 of those invitations all over Manhattan and say, free cake at this address at this time. And on the day of the party, your daughter's friends are trying to get there, and the streets are clogged, the doorway is jammed up, and they can't get in. That's essentially what a DDoS attack is. It is sending so much information toward a website that either the server itself can't handle the load and just shuts down, or in some cases that the internet connections being toward that server are just jammed up, and none of the legitimate requests can actually get in. So that's what a DDoS attack is.
And Project Shield makes more cake.
Yeah,
cake for everyone.
Project Shield is in some ways sort of like, I don't know if a bouncer is the right analogy, but kind of a ticket taker maybe. Going, oh, are you actually legitimately invited to this party? You're a reader of the news site and you're not trying to attack it and take it down. Great, we'll pass that through. Nope, you're sending too many requests. You look like an attacker. We'll try to keep those out to keep the site actually up and running. And for a lot of these, particularly the more vulnerable sites, I mean, there are sites that we protect that they can handle, a couple dozen queries per second maybe. They're not, in a lot of cases you're talking about independent journalists who don't have a ton of resources. So they may not be on a real robust hosting platform or have lots of technical capabilities. And a really small attack that, for most of the companies in the world wouldn't be a big deal can actually take them down and silence them.
I think that's an interesting thing, because when people talk about the media in the United States anyway, they think about the New York Times, CNN, those massive sites getting shut down. You're actually protecting people that are working at a much, much smaller level and just trying to reach hundreds or even just thousands of people on a daily basis.
Yeah, the threat from DDoS attacks is, I mean, it's growing. We kind of know that, but it does span the spectrum, right? I mean, last year, this has slowed down a little bit over this year, but I mean, New Year's Eve 2015, BBC went down, and they reported on that from a DDoS attack. And they've got some pretty serious infrastructure. They were taken down. In, I think, April of last year, 7 sites in Sweden, they're kind of the top 7 news sites in Sweden, were all taken down in a concerted attack. But those are the ones that get into the news. And for smaller organizations, whether it is Maljak Angola, which is one of the sites we protect, that's an independent investigative journalist in Angola, possibly the only independent investigative journalist in Angola. He's trying to do his job. He's not a technology guy. It really doesn't take much to send some traffic toward his site and take it down.
So who would be targeting somebody like him?
It really depends. And I think one of the things that has happened over the last couple of years is that access to launching these kind of attacks has gotten much, much easier. Right? You can go out and launch an attack for, I mean, you can find a site that'll do it for $5 or $10, something like that. Not a particularly big one, but might be enough to take somebody like this down. And the different attackers or attack kind of groupings, for lack of a better word, really are, I mean, everything from you have a government who doesn't want information to be published. That's a direct form of censorship, and kind of the censorship that we often think of, which is the government stopping information from getting out. But you also see individuals who just don't like an article. They disagree with the author, or they don't like a comment that's on an article, and they go out and they find one of these booter sites to try to launch an attack against it, and it goes down that way. Outside of the space that we work in, there are lots of other reasons, right? Gamers are DDoSing each other all the time and trying to get an edge in their Minecraft server or something like that. I mean, I think we're kind of training an entire new generation of attackers just through, through what happens in the gaming space. Or commercial competitors will attack each other. But in our case, it's almost always somebody who's trying to censor information, but that can go all the way down to the individual level of somebody who just disagrees. And
I think there used to be a certain amount of technical expertise that was required in order to launch one of these attacks. I'd say it was largely hacker-on-hacker crime, but now you allude to this online marketplace where you don't have to know how it's being done. You just need to log on, find the right source, and then hand over either Bitcoin or probably Bitcoin, or your credit card information, but most likely Bitcoin at this point.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, you do, but you're right. I mean, you do find sites that are out there that, I mean, they're branding themselves as network stressing tools, right? Of go, oh, we will help check to see if your network is strong enough to hold up to an attack. They don't actually check to make sure that the site that you want to stress is yours. So that's kind of where it diverts over onto the side. They'll take payment. I mean, and some of these sites are really interesting. You go and look at them, and they look like really professional commercial services with here's our pricing structure, here's a monthly subscription model that you can get to. And so you're absolutely right. You don't have to understand the command and control and kind of zombie network of infected computers and things like that that are actually used to deliver the attack. All you have to know is what are the keywords you have to go and find these services with, and then you can go out and launch one. Of course, there are much more organized and kind of big infrastructure attackers out there, whether that's, at kind of the nation-state level or more organized criminal organizations. But it really, it has become truly, truly easy to go out and try and take somebody down with these attacks.
What is the mix of people doing this at this point? Is it, we hear a lot about the nation-state actors when attacks are big enough, they go, this must have been a nation-state because it was that well coordinated. Is that the majority of the attacks? Is it business attacks? Is it criminal activity that's behind a lot of this?
So I don't know the answer to that generally. Our focus is really on these kind of important sources of information, whether they're news publishers or human rights organizations. My sense, and we don't do a ton of forensics, our focus is much more on how do we keep these sites protected? Because if we can keep them protected and we can use our infrastructure and the defenses we've built, then who's doing the attack doesn't really matter anymore. So a lot of other people do a lot of forensic investigation into that, and I think there's some good reporting out there on it. But what we see in talking to our users, because we'll often ask them, what do you think drew this attack? And it spans the range, right? And it depends on where they are, and it depends on what they're reporting on. In some cases, they'll go, well, there's a political faction that doesn't want a certain piece of information about this candidate to come out, and so they're attacking us in that way. In other cases, they're very clear that it is the government, whether it's transparently the government or kind of through multiple kind of indirection points. So I think the answer is it's all of the above, and where that exact mix is, I don't know. I don't frankly worry about it that much.
One of the most fascinating stories of last year was when Brian Krebs got attacked, and his site got taken down. And the thing that was shocking about it was not necessarily that he was the target of an attack, because he writes about security. He's been doing it for 20 years. It's not surprising he would be a target, but he had great protections. He had Akamai backing him up and caching his site. But the scale of the attack was so huge that none of them had ever seen anything like it. And it did wind up taking him offline until you guys stepped in. And then it turns out it was kind of a new type of attack, and it wasn't based on PCs or even phones anymore. It was about the Internet of Things.
Right, right. Yeah, no, that was an interesting weekend, to say the least. You're talking about the Mirai botnet, and that was kind of the first instance, I think, that any of us had seen that in the wild, at least. And and I want to circle back to something that Brian wrote after that attack related to what we were just talking about. But that particular instance was, instead of having maybe a couple thousand computers that have been infected with malware, and that you've got your command and control set up and you can launch from them, it was source code. The source code is up on GitHub now, right? It's out there, kind of in the public. They'll go out and use vulnerabilities in security cameras, I think primarily in that case, but you could imagine that happening to any device. And the big difference there was the number of devices that were launching the attack all at once. And because it was a layer 7 attack,
what is it?
So layer 7 so there are kind of two general categories of DDoS attacks, and there's a lot more to go into the weeds, but there are network layer attacks using kind of the fundamentals of the internet. to send just pure network traffic to try to jam up the pipes, for lack of a better word, going into a site and take it down that way. Application layer attacks or layer 7 attacks are using HTTP requests, which is what our browsers send to a server to try to get a web page back. They're sending lots and lots of those HTTP requests. And one of the things that's challenging about layer 7 attacks is if you get enough devices sending traffic all at once, if you can control 5,000, 10,000, 15,000 devices and amp up the amount of traffic they're sending a little bit, it might just look like an article has gone viral versus it's an attack. And so I think that was one of the things that changed for all of us doing the mitigation, is going, all right, now how do you defend when it just sort of looks like a university just came online and all tried to hit the site at the same time?
It's not as if one address is getting 10,000, 15,000 hits. It's 15,000 devices all asking for one copy at the same time.
Yeah, or 2 or 3. I mean, you know, and the actual attack patterns vary, but yeah, that's essentially right. I mean, the first D in DDoS is distributed, right? I mean, and you can have a DOS attack which just comes from one place. I mean, if you have a good enough computer, you send, you know, 500 queries, 1,000 queries per second at a site, that's pretty easy to detect. You go, that's one device and it's sending all that traffic. That doesn't look like a human. The more you can spread it out, the harder it becomes to actually defend against.
You said you want to bring up something else.
Yeah, I mean, so Brian wrote a really interesting article after this happened that was titled "The Democratization of Censorship," and it's you know, it's still, I mean, it's almost exactly a year since all of this happened now, but I think it's still very, very relevant because it is, you know, not just with DDoS attacks, but all the different ways that people try to stop others' points of view from coming out. The technical tools and the digital tools are becoming much more accessible through things like what we were talking about with how you can find sites that will launch DDoS attacks for you. And so, you know, I think even just 5 years ago, if you wanted to suppress somebody else's point of view and do it in the technical space, you had to have some chops and some skills, or you'd have to really know somebody who did. Today, like any of these attacks, whether it's DDoS or something else, you can go out and you can find somebody who will do it for you, and that opens up the ability to try to censor information to really everyone who's connected to the internet.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing that we live in a world where it's easier than ever to share, easier than ever to get information out there, and yet when you douse conversations with enough information, they become unintelligible. And this has been a lot of Twitter's problem in trying to have, you know, popular people who've become magnets for trolls. They can't use the service anymore because there's just so much noise and so little signal by comparison.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right, and I think there is, you know, we were talking about kind of the bigger sites, the ones that people will think of, whether it's, you know, a BBC or a New York Times or something, and of course they have to defend themselves from these kinds of attack as well. But, you know, when you think about the long tail of important information that's out there, the individual journalists, the local papers in the US, many of whom are, you know, struggling with their business model, running kind of on a shoestring, all of them are vulnerable to these kind of attacks, and to get rich conversation happening, you really do need to have a lot of different points of view. It can't all just be kind of in 1 or 2 or 3 major sites. And so that's part of why we think this is so important, is to go, yes, you know, the big guys should be protected, the brands that we all know of. Yes, the major papers or the major publishers in a country should be protected, but so should the Kenya National Commission on Human Rights, which is publishing important information. It's not a big site. They don't have a technical team. That's part of the conversation. And you know, I was just with a small group of our team in Kenya about 3 weeks ahead of their elections, kind of looking at how digital threats were evolving there. And you know, the citizens in Kenya really want this information. But if you only protect the 3 or 4 sources of kind of the major news or something like that, that's not the full picture. You know, so getting the independent journalists, getting the investigative journalists, getting the human rights organizations, and everybody who's kind of in that more vulnerable state, I think is incredibly important to do.
And getting up and running with Project Shield seems to me relatively straightforward. There's no price. It's a free service.
Yep.
You have to register and put a little bit of code on your site in order to get it up and running.
Almost. That's almost right. So
simplified.
Yeah, and we continue to work to make it easier and easier because of the people that we're trying to protect, to make it as quick and as simple to get up and online as possible. You're right. There's an application process. So Shield is free for news organizations and journalists, for human rights orgs and for elections monitoring sites. We get tons of applications from other people who aren't eligible, and we go, great, there are other services that you can go to. Quick application process. Once you're in, you just need to know where your information is being published, the origin server, where we will retrieve it from. If you're using SSL, we get that set up for you. And then you don't have to put code on your site, you change your DNS settings. So the way that Shield works, it's a reverse proxy. So requests toward a particular website first come to us. DNS is what controls that. So you change your DNS settings, point them to us. We get the request, decide if it's good or bad, pass it through if it's good.
So you protect journalists, you protect election commissions. Is there anyone that you would not protect, that you'd get an application, you'd be like, look, you're not a business, but you're also not an organization that we want to provide protection services?
Yeah, I mean, we have these eligibility guidelines. So anyone who is A, in those eligible groups, and B, is compliant with our content and conduct policy, which is kind of a Google standard thing, we'll take them. And part of our goal at Jigsaw is to help protect and promote free expression. So we get a lot of sites that come through that we go, that's interesting. I may or may not agree with that point of view. We actively try to make sure that we're protecting all the different points of view that we see, as long as they're in those eligibility buckets.
All right. So a broad interpretation of different messages that are out there. You want to support as many opinions as possible.
Yep. Absolutely.
So we've talked a lot about denial of service attacks. What is the next frontier for shutting down free speech and denying access to the larger conversation online?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I mean, I don't think that we're near the end of the DDoS threat. And what we're starting to see, so a couple of things come to mind, particularly with this focus on the more vulnerable users that are out there. One is that there are a lot more multi-vector attacks starting to happen. So in the past, you might just launch a network layer attack that we were talking about, and that was enough to take somebody down. Defenses have gotten better. So now you're starting to see a DDoS attack, maybe at the same time as somebody's trying to penetrate the server itself to be able to deface or change content. Or you're seeing a different type of application layer attack, cross-site scripting or injection attacks, things like that, all at the same time. So I think the level of complexity of these attacks is going up. One of the other threats that we think about at Jigsaw is not only suppression of information at the server, which is really what Shield is focused on, but also suppression of information as it goes across the wire. So are things like really restrictive firewalls or censorship systems, essentially, to say, well, you can access some information, but not others. That's a growing issue. So thinking about ways to help keep access to information open for everybody, not just for people who live in New York or something like that. I think the other piece of it is keeping up with how we make it easy for people to defend themselves. And you asked about how easy is it to set up Shield. I think that we in the industry, in the tech industry in general, and in security in particular, we have a lot of work to do to make sure that we're keeping up with keeping the defenses accessible to everyone, so that you don't just have to be at a big company with a digital security team to be able to stay protected. That the different attack vectors that are out there, the different ways that information are being suppressed, continue to get more and more complicated. We have to not only keep up with that, but start going faster in terms of making the defenses accessible to everybody who's out there.
All right, I want to get to some of the questions I ask all my guests.
Sure.
What technological trend concerns you the most? Is there something that keeps you up at night?
A lot of things keep me up at night. Yeah, there's actually two that come to mind. One is, and you alluded to this a little bit in terms of the conversations and how people are actually talking to each other. I think that in digital conversations in particular, the balance of listening versus shouting at each other is getting worse and worse, and I think that has, pretty profound implications for how we communicate with each other, how we resolve differences of opinion. We want to keep access to all of the information available to everyone, but you also want to be able to discuss it reasonably well. And I think the trend right now, and we all experience, like if you're on the internet, you experience this. If you're on Twitter at 2 in the morning, you're going like, I would like to have a little bit less shouting and a little bit more listening. So that's one, and how we improve conversation generally. A second, and even setting aside the stuff that we deal with Shield, more in the geopolitical context is the question of how prepared are we as as a country, as society, as different players around the globe for cyber warfare and kind of cyber attacks at the state level or at the non-state level, as it may be. And our CEO, George Conard, published a really good op-ed about this in the New York Times recently. And that, there's a lot of work to be done to start thinking about how do we start to align ourselves about how are we going to deal with these kind of threats, how do we avoid escalation, different things like that.
I think there was an assumption for a long time that we were entering into a cyber warfare age, but that we would win it. We would have advantages. We've got better technology. All the tech companies started here, and that we would do pretty well in this new age. And yet it seems like the stories we keep hearing are we're more vulnerable than we've ever been before.
I think both might be true. And it's not, what kind of capabilities and defenses do the different governments have, whether it's the U.S. or somebody else, is not my area of expertise. But I think that what we were talking about the democratization of attacks is a part of that, where the easier it gets and the tools that are out there to launch attacks, becoming easier to use means that anybody can try to start something going on. The amount of network infrastructure that there is in the world and the amount of computing capacity means that anybody who's in control of that kind of infrastructure is able to influence it. They have bigger and bigger weapons essentially at their disposal right now, and we're not talking about at kind of a policy level as much as we could. What are we going to do about that? What are all of the things that make it more dangerous today than maybe it was 20 years ago?
Yeah. It's interesting stuff, and I also think when you talk about the conversations, I feel like we don't have a system of manners or etiquette or just common communication. When two people are talking, you don't talk over each other. Right. Not for very long. It's you take turns, and you kind of have to listen to the other person. When you're online, you can have arguments with 50 different people in real time, all at once, and never read anything that they're saying.
Absolutely.
And you see people do it full time.
Yeah.
And we don't know how to deal with that type of ability to constantly broadcast.
Right, and be spreading it all in different directions, to not have to look in the person's eyes. And we talk about this a lot. There is a flip side to that too, which is that for a lot of people who may not have been in the conversation, who are in marginalized groups or other places, online communication and online conversation may open up new avenues for them to actually be heard. But if they're all being talked over, if we're all talking over each other, that's not happening. So I think there's a lot of work to do to bring the opportunity to the front without just starting to shout at each other all the time, and that's all that we ever do.
Completely agree. On a more positive note, is there a technology or service that you use every day that's changed your life?
I think the things we use every day, by definition, have probably changed our life. So there's all sorts of different things. The mobile devices are incredible, right? The meditation apps that you've got on there, WhatsApp for communicating with people overseas who otherwise would be once every 6 months or something, is amazing. For me, though, I think all of those are built on the underpinning, and this may sound kind of old and stodgy, but of the internet itself, right? I can imagine a life in a world without almost any individual service, even without a smartphone, or without, the ability to carry my entire music library around with me, or the ability to, to snap, exactly what I'm doing to my friends at any given time. I could take any of those away, and I think I'd be fine. But the notion of a digitally connected world, which is really what the internet gave us, if you take that away, all the rest of those things, or a lot of the rest of those things that I think we would often name, go away. And you lose so much. I mean, the access to information that we've got, the ability to go out, answer a question, reach out to anybody on the planet, and stay connected with them. There's no individual app or device that is as important as that underpinning of the internet and doing that. And that's, I remember starting to play around with the internet in the late 80s and going, what is this thing? Yeah. And it's, it's as amazing today as it was then, and we've learned how to do lots and lots more with it. Yeah,
and what's interesting is that you talk to anybody younger than you or I, and they don't remember those days.
Right.
They've never lived in a world where not only did they not have the internet, access to the internet, but they've got it in their pocket.
Right.
All the time. And their assumptions about technology and connectivity and community are totally different than what we grew up with.
Yeah. Yeah.
So things are changing quickly.
Absolutely.
So how can people follow what you're doing with Project Shield and what you're doing personally online?
Twitter's the best place. Please don't shout.
Keep it down.
Yeah, at George Conard on Twitter, and at Jigsaw Team for the larger Jigsaw group that's going on.
All right, we did tease at the beginning of the show that we were broadcasting from North Korea.
Right.
So I think we should probably explain that before we go off air.
Yeah, let's do that. So we at Jigsaw, we work a lot with people in different countries around the world, and particularly in repressive societies. And so to help remind us of where those people are and where the people are that we're trying to serve, the different conference rooms that we have around the office space here are named after different countries that have challenges like that. And we happen to be in the conference room named North Korea, which has probably got some of the biggest challenges when it comes to digital repression and other fun stuff going on.
Well, I appreciate you having this conversation with me today, especially inside North Korea. I don't think that many of these conversations happen in North Korea these days.
Totally.
But thanks so much for doing this.
No, it's been a pleasure.
That has been Fast Forward for today. If you want to see back episodes of this show, you can find them on PCMag.com, of course. You can also find them on Apple Podcasts, on Google Play, and wherever else fine podcasts are given away for free. Thanks so much for joining us today. See you next week.